Okay, welcome. Today we're going to go over some of the basic observations that I wanted you to make on the innovations in Greek stone architecture slides. We'll also go over the distinctions between the different types of Greek columns as well as the essential features of the Etruscan and or Greek roofs. Greek roofs are very similar to the Etruscan roofs. So without further ado, let's get going. All right. So here is the first set of comparisons between the Greek and Egyptian architecture. Now, there are a couple of different things. We've already seen quite a bit of Egyptian architecture. We can see like the post and lintel here. We can see a basic post and lintel there. This is somewhat of a smaller building. It's more of a more of kind of an entryway into a temple or something like that. But even here, we do have some. Those are slightly slanted, but we do basically have flat roofs on this building. So that was one thing to notice, that the Greeks definitely on this building had angled roofs. Okay, another thing was hoping you'd pick up is sort of the size of the columns. The Egyptians have similar forms in the columns. But they tend to be a lot smaller. The Greek columns make the building appear significantly larger, and that provides significantly more space. Now, the one other thing really worth noting on this image here, and it'll be on the next one as well, is that there is no roof. Now, this is a Greek ruin, and the actual buildings would have had roofs, but in this one, we don't see a roof. So you might think about why that's the case. Why would the stone last but the roof be gone? Well, the roof clearly wasn't made of stone then. So what we have to conclude is that must have been made of something else. Probably wood. And that turns out to be a pretty good guess. We know this from other sources. Obviously, a lot of the wood has either, rotted away in the years since then. In some cases, like with the Parthenon, it was replaced and then ultimately destroyed and then just left. I believe the roof of the Parthenon was destroyed in World War I. When the Ottomans were taking shelter in it, as I recall. But in any event, this is sort of the main thing, is that that the roofing is different, including the form of the roofing, the columns are bigger, and there's just in general more space in a lot of these Greek structures. So here we have two of the most famous structures in each set of architecture, the pyramids and this is one pyramid. I think this is Khafre's pyramid, but I'm not entirely certain. And the famous Greek structure, the Parthenon on the Acropolis at Athens. So Parthenon looks somewhat similar to the previous. This is a temple of Poseidon in Sicily, I believe. The Parthenon looks somewhat similar to that, so you can see some evidence of similarity throughout a lot of Greek structures. I did note in the previous slide that the Parthenon's roof is a little bit more damaged. It's not just like you have sort of we can see the roof structure here. It's just the roof itself is gone. Even the roof structure is starting to look a little rough in the Parthenon. But really the main comparison I wanted to make with this one and comparing two of the most famous structures is sort of in the use. So you could have still seen a lot of the observations, but the Egyptian structures were very, very large, very impressive, an enormous amount of stone, but very difficult to use. If you think back to the images of the interior, the hallways were very narrow with those corbelled vault hallways. So we don't they were more difficult to use. They weren't really meant for people to use them. They were meant as tombs. Whereas the inner space of the Parthenon kind of shows that it is meant to be used. It was designed with a function in mind. Probably a temple or maybe a gathering spot, but definitely some sort of function in mind. And one of the reasons, basically the fact that it has no roof now, it had a wooden roof before, it was able to be a lot bigger because those wooden roofs were in place there, as opposed to, having a stone roof like a lot of these Egyptian structures do. So this is a set of columns, this third set of comparisons, and it's a set of columns comparing both the Egyptian and Greek columns. Now, one thing in particular I wanted you to note is that the form is very similar. It's a basic line of posts and lintels. And when we line up a number of posts and lintels, number of columns really, but it's really a post and lintel structure. When we line up a number of columns and put, lintels across all the top of them, we give that structure a name. This is both called a colonnade or colonnade. So this thing and this thing are both considered colonnades. But the main thing to notice about the Greek colonnades is that the pillars tend to be larger and the colonnades tend to be longer. And by larger, I don't just mean they're thicker. They have the same proportions. They're narrower. They were probably a little bit more difficult to construct, and you might even be able to start to get a sense of how they were more difficult to construct and how you might make these longer columns, these tall narrow columns possible, even if you couldn't necessarily do it all at once, which tended to be the Egyptian method. So that was the main thing to see there. With this one, I wanted to actually show you a roof, how it would look similar to a Greek temple. Like I said, this is in an Etruscan temple. This is a model. But basically what we have here is we have the columns here. And you can see that we do have kind of columns behind it. So we have colonnades that are kind of holding up the roof. Over here we've got, more of a wall proper. But then what we have across it is we have these little wooden structures here that are then propping the rafters up. So if you can imagine, these wooden structures are kind of running down the length of the temple. And there's another one. And basically, those things are what's propping the roof itself up. Now, what we would see here is that basically what needs to happen is we would need to have some sort of fastener at all of these points on the props, propping up the rafters on top of these longer lintels. Okay? And we'd fasten the roof, the rafters down, and then maybe we'd fasten the rafters together at the top. But we'd fasten the rafters onto these longer lintels there that are being propped up by this colonnade here. So makes the roof significantly lighter than if you were to try and make it, a stone triangular arch. And when you're using wood, you have more options for fasteners. Like you can use nails, you can use other things like that. You can even carve the wood so it interlocks with one another. It's like a mortise and tenon type thing. But you have more options when it comes to fastening the wood together. So the next one is a diagram of that. You can see it a little bit better. So what we would have here is we would have kind of these lintels. So we'd have the lintels. And you could have another lintel right here. You might even consider these things. That one's probably not actually, but basically, you could also have some lintels running kind of in and out of the page as well. And then what you have here is you have these little pieces, and I circled one already, but these little pieces that are propping the roof up. So this sort of diagram of making a wooden roof this way is called the prop and lintel. And basically how you would make it is you would have just a standard, set of columns. You'd put wooden lintels instead of stone lintels. You might put stone lintels, but a lot of times you put wood because you want to be able to fasten the props to the lintel there so that they can then hold the roof up. And then you would bring on the slanted elements, the rafters. And I did say I wanted you to keep in mind what the structure was similar to. It's kind of like a wooden triangular arch, really. That's really how these wooden rafters are kind of being adapted from stone. People probably had done this with wood before, so it wasn't like they had to discover it with stone, but it's using a similar form with a different material that gives some advantage. So very useful in being able to create lighter roofs, also roofs that water would slide off of, possibly snow would slide off of, and then being able to make the temple a bit more spacious inside, or the structure in general. So now we get to comparing the columns. So what we have here are some of these Egyptian columns. And you can see just we've got a person for comparison there. So this column is quite large. But it's also quite broad. So it's not that the Egyptian columns can't be tall. They certainly can. It's that when they get tall, they tend to be broad as well. Now, this one's a little bit more difficult. I think a person would be about that tall. So these are about twice as tall as a person, if I were to guess. But I would need a better scale in order to be able to figure that out. So you can have tall columns in Egyptian architecture, but they do tend to need to be broader if you're going to make them taller. Another thing that the Egyptians tend to do was put hieroglyphics on their columns. When we go to the Greek columns, we're not going to see that nearly as much. So this is the first set of Greek columns, and one of the main things to notice here is one that they are thinner than Egyptian columns, and we've already talked about this, so I won't spend too much time on that one there. But just in contrast to the Egyptian columns, what you have here is instead of having, let's look at this one right here, instead of having hieroglyphics on the column, you have these ridges and sort of valleys in it. We call this fluting of the columns. So we call that fluting, and that is what makes it's one of the things that is very common among Greek and then later Roman columns. So eventually they do start making them smooth again. We'll see that as well when we continue to look at Roman architecture. Okay, so this is the first set of Greek columns. I'm going to tell you the name of the first set of Greek columns now. Greek columns 1 should in fact be Doric columns. And when we look at all of them, we'll go back and we'll talk about what the essential features of each type of column are. But here we have another set, and you can see kind of what's going on. They're pretty simple. The main thing we have here is we have fluting in the column, and you can see this. This is a modern. This is not an ancient structure. This one here is not ancient. The one on the right, it's modern, and it's newer. I believe this is in Greece. Yeah, it's the Greek flag. So kind of showing the architecture, but made, fairly recently. And then at the top, we kind of have this very simple sort of thing to prop up the lintel. So we can see those there as well. This at the top is called the capital. And that is one of the things that Doric columns do. They have quite a simple capital. So even if we go back to the Egyptian capitals are a little bit more ornate than the Doric capitals. So the Doric capitals were meant to be much, much simpler columns. When we go to the next set of columns, these are Ionic columns. So more popular in a different area of Greece. One of the main things is that the fluting tends to be a little bit the ridges tend to be higher, and the valleys tend to be a little bit deeper in Ionic columns. That's not a hard and fast rule. It's just one of the things I've noticed. Now, what you have at the top of all of your Ionic columns, and we'll go even to the next one, is you have this sort of capital with the spiral. And it's a significantly more ornate capital, so we can see it there. Again, this one on the right is a modern sort of version. But you have a significantly more ornate capital with this spiral at the top of the capital. So that is one of the key things to notice about Ionic columns. Another thing to notice is that their base tends to be a little bit different. It tends to have a little bit more form. So this is called the base. Occasionally the pedestal. So you might hear me use that term interchangeably, so I'll write that, base or the pedestal. Pedestal is a little bit confusing because sometimes by pedestal we mean this sort of small column that you put something important on. So that, but when we're talking about the pedestal of a column, we mean that base structure. Now we compare that to the Doric columns. They did not have. There was a lot of times the column just sat on the ground. So we can see that in Doric there. We can see here the Doric has no pedestal. Definitely still has a capital. We can see the capitals here, but no pedestals. Now, one of the reasons that Ionic columns tend to use pedestals is that they do tend to be taller and more narrow than not only than Egyptian columns, but than Doric columns as well. So having both this broader base for the column makes the column a little bit more sturdy when it's more narrow like that. So moving on to the third one. This is actually a variation on Ionic, and it is called Corinthian. And you'll notice that it has similar sorts of things. The deep fluting of the Ionic columns. They're tall and narrow like the Ionic columns, and they have a pedestal like the Ionic columns. The main difference to point out is the capital tends to be very ornate, tends to be sculpted. Corinthian column. The capital tends to have sculpted leaves in it, so that is one of the things that makes the Corinthian columns significantly different than, not significantly, but is more an advance on the Ionic columns, and the Romans tended to like these as well. The Romans liked the capitals. They would occasionally get rid of the fluting. You'll see Corinthian columns without the fluting as well, but that the main distinction is the different type of capital. I wanted it to look prettier, wanted it to look a little bit more fancy than what you saw in the Ionic or the Doric columns. Okay, so that is it for all of the observations. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in the next lesson.